The world had narrowed to the howl of wind and the blinding white of driven snow. Ilara's hands were numb fists, the rein slick with ice, her knuckles split and bleeding against the frozen leather. The horse, a good mare with more heart than sense, had stumbled one final time, the snap of the wagon's axle a sound as sharp and final as a breaking bone. Now the animal stood shivering, head low, defeated by the blizzard that had descended from the mountains with no warning. Ilara had tried to unhitch her, to lead her on, but her fingers refused to work the frozen buckles. They were stranded. She slid from the driver's seat, her legs collapsing under the sudden weight of her exhaustion. The cold was a physical thing, a predator sinking its teeth into her marrow. She crawled toward the meager shelter of the overturned wagon, knowing it was a pointless gesture. This was how it ended. Not in a dusty room with a man's weight on top of her, or at the end of a bottle, but alone, frozen into the unyielding landscape. A shape emerged from the white chaos, vast and dark. At first, she thought it was a bear, or perhaps a spectre her freezing mind had conjured. But the shape was on horseback, solid, real. A man dismounted, his movements economical and sure, insulated from the storm's fury by a heavy sheepskin coat. He did not speak. He knelt, his face obscured by a low-brimmed hat and a scarf pulled high. He assessed the broken axle, the spent mare, and finally her, huddled and shivering. His gaze was steady, unreadable. Without a word, he unstrapped a thick wool blanket from his saddle, wrapped it around her shoulders, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing. The world tilted, the scent of pine and cold leather filling her senses. He placed her on his own horse, mounting behind her, his body a solid wall against the wind. He worked quickly to free her mare, tying its lead to his saddle horn. Then they were moving, cutting a path through the white oat, his arm a firm, impersonal bar across her waist, holding her in place. She was too cold to fight, too tired to question. She simply leaned back against the heat of him, a stranger, and let the darkness take the edge off the pain. The cabin was one room, built of dark, heavy logs chinked with mud and moss. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. He laid her on a rope bed in the corner, the mattress stuffed with straw that rustled beneath her weight. He moved about the small space with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. He stoked the embers in the hearth, adding kindling until a small flame flickered to life. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket by the door and hung it over the growing fire. All of this he did without looking at her, granting her the privacy of his inattention. Ilara watched him through slitted eyes, her body slowly, painfully, beginning to thaw. The man, Silas, as she would later learn his name was tall and broad, his movements deliberate. He shed his snow-caked coat, revealing a man made of hard lines and quiet strength. He never rushed. He brought her a mug of hot water, gesturing for her to drink. It was just water, not tea, not coffee, but it was the most welcome thing she had ever tasted. She wrapped her trembling hands around the tin mug, the heat a shock against her frozen skin. He saw the way she struggled and took the mug, holding it to her lips himself. His touch was brief, practical. He fed the fire, checked on the horses in the lean-to she could hear stamping outside, and then sat in a straight-backed wooden chair across the room, cleaning a piece of tack with an oiled rag. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the scream of the wind outside. He did not ask her name. He did not ask where she was going or where she had come from. He had saved her from the storm, and now he was simply letting her be. For a woman who had spent her life being looked at, measured, and used, his quiet disregard was a strange and unsettling gift. She was a piece of salvage washed up in his home, and he was waiting for the storm to pass. That was all. She pulled the rough blanket tighter, the exhaustion a tide pulling her under, and for the first time in years, she slept without a knife under her pillow. The storm lasted a week. The snow piled up against the single window, sealing them inside the dim, firelit world of the cabin. Time became a slow, repeating rhythm of chores and silence. Silas would rise before dawn, his movements quiet as he fed the fire and saw to the animals. He would melt snow for water, cook a simple breakfast of oatmeal or bacon, and they would eat on opposite sides of the small wooden table. He never tried to fill the silence. He seemed to exist within it as naturally as a fish in water. Ilara, accustomed to the noise and chaos of crowded rooms and loud men, found it both calming and terrifying. At first, she stayed on the bed, a spectator to his life. She watched his hands, calloused and capable, as he repaired a bridle, sharpened an axe, or stitched a tear in his canvas trousers. They were hands that knew work, that understood the properties of wood and leather and steel. They were not the soft, grasping hands she was used to. On the third day, restless and feeling the uselessness of her position, she rose and took the broom from its corner. She swept the floor, her movement stiff. He glanced up from his work, a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, but only nodded once before returning to his task. It was an acknowledgement. An acceptance. From then on, she helped. She learned to bank the fire at night and coax it back to life in the morning. She scrubbed the cast-iron skillet and refilled the water bucket. These small acts were a language between them, a way of saying she was not merely a burden. She was earning her keep. She mended her own dress, her needlework clumsy but determined. One afternoon, he laid a pair of his own wool socks on the hearth to warm. When they were heated through, he walked over and placed them on the foot of her bed. He said nothing, just turned and walked away. The simple, unspoken gesture of care was so foreign it almost broke her. She pulled the warm, clean socks on, the rough wool a comfort against her skin, and felt a dangerous crack appear in the wall she kept built around her heart. When the sun finally broke through, the world outside was a pristine, blinding expanse of white. The snow was deep, the passes impassable for weeks to come. She could not leave, even if she wanted to. A part of her, a part she refused to acknowledge, was relieved. The end of the storm marked a change. They could now move outside the confines of the cabin, and the scope of their shared work expanded. He showed her how to clear a path to the well, how to knock the heavy loads of snow from the pine boughs before they snapped. He moved with an innate understanding of the land, reading the signs in the snow, knowing where the drifts would be deepest. One morning, he led her to a section of fence that had been crushed by a fallen tree. "The wire is snapped," he said. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her. He handed her a pair of heavy leather gloves from a pouch on his belt. They were worn, mold to the shape of his hands. They spent the day working side by side, their breath pluming in the frigid air. He showed her how to stretch the wire taut with a fence stretcher, how to wrap it securely around the post. The work was hard, her muscles screaming in protest, but there was a clean satisfaction in it. They were not just mending a fence, they were restoring a boundary, bringing order back to a world thrown into chaos by the storm. It felt significant. That evening, as they sat by the fire, nursing their sore hands, she noticed he was carving a piece of wood. It was a small, simple bird, its wings half spread. He worked slowly, the knife peeling away delicate curls of pine, his focus absolute. He wasn't doing it for her, or for anyone. He was simply creating a small piece of beauty in the quiet hours, for no reason other than the act itself. She watched the bird take shape and felt the stillness of the cabin settle around her, less a cage and more a sanctuary. Spring arrived not as a gentle transition but as a messy, protracted thaw. The world turned to mud and slush. The creek swelled, and the sound of running water was a constant murmur beneath the chirping of the first returning birds. With the melting snow came the promise of new life and new work. A foal was born to her mare, a gangly, fragile thing that she and Silas helped into the world on a cold, wet night. He worked with a veterinarian's gentle competence, guiding the foal, clearing its airways, while Ilara rubbed the mare down and spoke to her in low, soothing tones. In the lantern light of the stable, their hands brushed, and for a moment, they shared a look of mutual respect, of shared accomplishment. This was something good, something clean. Silas decided to build a new chicken coop, the old one having been damaged by the winter. He felled the trees himself, squared the logs with a broad axe, and began to lay the foundation. Ilara found herself drawn into the project. She carried stones for the foundation, stripped bark from the logs, and learned to hold the timbers steady as he notched them. The steady rhythm of the hammer and saw became the soundtrack to their days. He taught her the difference between a dovetail and a saddle notch, his explanations direct and patient. He never condescended, never grew frustrated with her inexperience. He treated her as a capable partner. One sweltering afternoon, while lifting a heavy ridgepole into place, her grip slipped. The beam tilted, threatening to fall. Before she could cry out, his hand was there, covering hers, steadying the load. His palm was rough against the back of her hand, his strength a solid, reassuring presence. They held the beam together for a long moment, their bodies close, the sun beating down on them. "I've got it," he said, his voice low. "We've got it," she corrected, her own voice barely a whisper. He looked at her then, a long, searching look, and a slow nod was his only reply. They were building something more than a shelter for chickens. They were building a life, one log at a time. The arrival of a supply peddler in early summer was a disruption, a reminder that a world existed beyond the boundaries of the ranch. The man was talkative, full of news from the towns down in the valley. He spoke of new saloons, of men who had struck it rich, of women who followed them. Ilara stood behind Silas, feeling a familiar cold dread coil in her stomach. She kept her face down, her hands hidden in the folds of her skirt, praying the man wouldn't recognize her. He didn't. To him, she was just the rancher's quiet wife or hired help. But the peddler's casual words brought the past rushing back in a foul tide. That night, she couldn't sleep. The ghosts were back, whispering in the dark corners of the cabin. She saw faces she had tried to forget, felt hands that had left bruises on her soul. She slipped out of bed and went to the hearth, staring into the dying embers as if seeking an answer there. The floorboards creaked behind her. Silas was standing there, a silhouette against the faint moonlight from the window. He didn't speak, just came and added a log to the fire, coaxing the flames back. He poured 2 cups of water and sat in his chair, gesturing to the floor by the hearth. Hesitantly, she sat, wrapping her arms around her knees. The silence stretched, but it was different this time. It was a space he was holding open for her. "Sometimes the nights are long," he said finally, his voice quiet. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, an offering of understanding that required no explanation. She didn't have to tell him her story. He could see that she had won. And in his quiet, unassuming way, he was telling her she wasn't alone with it. Not tonight. They sat like that for hours, 2 solitary figures sharing the warmth of a small fire, while the past circled outside like a patient wolf. Autumn painted the aspens in strokes of brilliant gold and fiery orange. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of pine and drying earth. It was a season of gathering, of preparing for the winter to come. They worked in a comfortable, established rhythm, harvesting the small vegetable garden, stacking firewood, and repairing the roof of the main cabin. The frantic energy of spring and the hard labor of summer had given way to a quieter, more domestic pace. The companionship between them had solidified into something deep and unspoken. They no longer needed to talk to communicate. A glance, a nod, a shared look across the dinner table was enough. He knew she preferred the heel of the bread, she knew he took his coffee black. These were the small, intimate details that wove the fabric of a shared life. One afternoon, while they were salting bacon and hanging it to cure in the smokehouse, a sudden cold front moved in, bringing an early, icy rain. They were soaked through by the time they ran back to the cabin. Shivering, Ilara stood dripping by the fire as Silas threw on more logs. He disappeared for a moment and returned with his heaviest wool shirt. "Here," he said, holding it out. "It's dry." She took it, her fingers brushing his. She turned away to change, her back to him, expecting him to give her privacy. But when she turned back, wearing the shirt that was far too big for her, its sleeves rolled up, he was still there, watching her. His gaze was not hungry or possessive. It was soft, full of a quiet ache that she recognized because she felt it too. It was the look of a man who had been alone for a very long time. In that moment, the space between them shimmered with a new and potent awareness. The cabin, once a shelter from the storm outside, now felt like a shelter for the storm she had carried within her for so long. She saw in his eyes not a reflection of her sordid past, but a vision of a quiet, possible future. The first snow of the season came early, a light dusting that melted by noon but served as a stark reminder. Winter was coming again. An entire year had passed since the blizzard that had brought her here. The anniversary settled on Elara like a shroud. She had survived. She had found a measure of peace she never thought possible. But it felt fraudulent. The life she was living, this quiet, decent life, was built on a lie of omission. Silas knew she had a past, but he didn't know the depth of it, the filth of it. He saw the woman who could mend a fence and birth a foal, not the woman who had learned to survive by selling the only thing she had. The shame was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. She grew quiet, withdrawn, the easy companionship of autumn evaporating like mist. She put up walls he couldn't see but could certainly feel. He stopped trying to meet her gaze, his own quietness taking on a heavier, sadder quality. He gave her space, always, but now the space felt like a chasm. He thought he was giving her what she needed, but his respect for her privacy was its own kind of torture. It made his inevitable rejection, when he finally knew the truth, seem all the more certain. He was a good man. A simple man, in the best sense of the word. He deserved a good woman, a clean woman, not someone pieced together from the wreckage of a dozen squalid rooms. The thought of leaving was a constant, sharp pain in her chest. Leaving this place would be like tearing out her own heart. But staying, living this lie, was a slow poison. One evening, he found her staring out the window at the snow-dusted peaks, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Elara," he said, his voice gentle. "What is it?" She turned, and the anguish on her face was so plain, so raw, that he took an involuntary step back. She knew, then, that she had to tell him. She had to burn it all down to see if anything was real enough to survive the fire. The log in the fireplace popped, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. The sound was like a gunshot in the thick silence. Elara's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. Silas sat in his chair, waiting. He had been waiting all evening, his patience a tangible thing in the small room. She had to speak. The truth was a stone in her throat, choking her. She thought of the simple goodness of this man, of the way he had cared for her without asking for anything in return. She thought of the foal, the garden, the solid feel of the coop they had built together. It was a life she had no right to. Her voice, when it finally came, was a raw, broken thing. "You don't know me, Silas," he said nothing, his eyes fixed on her face, his expression unreadable. "The woman you saved from the storm. She wasn't just a traveler who lost her way," she took a ragged breath, forcing herself to meet his steady gaze. The confession had to be stark, brutal. No excuses, no softening the edges. She had to show him the ugliest part of herself so he could turn away, so he could be free of her. "I wasn't coming from anywhere good. I was running. To survive, I did what I had to." She looked down at her hands, the hands that he had seen mend and build and heal. They felt foreign to her, tainted. "There is no romance in my story. Only rooms and beds and men who paid for their time." The words hung in the air, heavy and obscene. She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with tears she refused to let fall. She delivered the final, killing blow. "I've slept with many men," she said. The statement was flat, devoid of emotion, a simple, damning fact. She watched his face, waiting for the disgust, the pity, the anger. She waited for him to stand up and tell her to leave. Silas did not move. He did not look away. The firelight carved deep shadows into the lines on his face, but his expression held none of the revulsion she had expected. He simply looked at her, at the whole of her, the woman trembling before him, offering up her shame like a sacrifice. His gaze was filled with a profound and aching sorrow, but it was not for what she had done. It was for what had been done to her. He seemed to see past the words, past the litany of nameless, faceless men, to the scared and desperate person who had endured it all. The silence stretched on, and in it, Elara felt her entire world balance on a knife's edge. He finally rose from his chair, and her heart seized. This was it. He crossed the small space between them in 2 strides. He did not reach for her in passion or in anger. He knelt before her so their eyes were level. And then, he did something that shattered the last of her defenses. He took her hand. His touch was not hesitant or questioning. It was firm, grounding, a calloused palm wrapping around her cold fingers, claiming them. He held her hand between both of his, a gesture of profound tenderness. He looked from her eyes to their joined hands and then back again. His own eyes were wet. "That was before," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "That was your survival. This," he squeezed her hand gently, "this is your life." She finally let a tear fall, then another. They traced paths down her face, washing away years of grime. He lifted his other hand and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "I've slept with many men," she whispered again, a final test, a plea for him to understand the depth of her unworthiness. He met her gaze without flinching, his love a steady, unwavering light in the darkness of her past. "I still love you," he said. And in those simple words, he did not erase her history. He embraced it. He took all the broken pieces of her and promised they had a home.